Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time with Lotus Field Combo. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these in-depth deck guides, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. And if you have a suggestion of what deck guide you want to see next, please consider leaving it in the comments. That said, let's get into Lotus Field Combo, one of the few pure combo decks in the Pioneer format. So this one is a deck based around getting copies of Lotus Field into play, which taps for 3 mana, and you have sacrifice 2 lands whenever it does. And then also, it has hexproof, so it cannot be targeted by your opponent's any type of interaction with lands they might have, such as Boseiju that we'll get to in a second. And finally, you want to copy your Lotus Field to get you 2 copies of Lotus Field on the battlefield with Thespian Stage, and then you kind of go off from there. At that point, you start casting things like Hidden Strings to untap your lands, accruing some mana, cycling some Vizier Tumbling Sands. And then the final one that you have for that, which also serves the purpose of digging for your payoff spells, is Pour Over the Pages, which draws 3 cards, untap up to 2 lands, then discard a card. So all of this leads to playing what do you do with this huge mana payoff. With this particular variant, you cast Immersion Ultimatum, looking for a copy of Omniscience, and then some spell that will allow you to get something out of your graveyard, out of your sideboard, which is Approach of the Second Sun, which we'll get to when we talk about the sideboard. And then you try to cast Approach, draw a couple cards, cast Approach again, win the game. Beyond that, you have different things to facilitate. You have Arboreal Grazer to facilitate extra land drops in the early turn, so you can get your Lotus Field on the battlefield sooner and defend your Electrical against decks like Red Deck Wins, etc. Sylvan Scrying to get your missing land piece, whether it be the copy of Lotus Field or the copy of Thespian Stage, possibly looking for both, although most hands that don't have either one of those or Sylvan Scrying you can't generally keep. And then you have your early card dig, things like Shimmer, Possibility, to recover what you're doing. Galvanic Adoration is one of the flex boss that we'll talk about in a minute. Delegate Recovery is both a land drop and a reclaim if you need it for spells out of your graveyard. And then you start getting into your payoffs. The first one is, or searches and payoffs. Leer, which kind of functions as a Past in Flames-esque effect, allowing you to recast your instant sorceries out of your graveyard. Also makes your spells uncounterable, which is very important. And then you have your tutors, things like Granted from Fae of Wishes, which allow you to look for things out of your graveyard, out of your sideboard, not graveyard. Mastermind's Acquisition, which allows you to search for things in either your deck or your sideboard. Behold the Beyond, which allows you to discard your hand and search your library for up to 3 cards. And then Dig Through Time, which is another way to dig through your deck. Once again, Immersion Ultimatum, those of you who don't know what it does, search your library for up to 3 monocolored cards with different names, exile them, and the opponent chooses one of those. Shuffle that card in your library, you may cast without paying their mana cost. A lot of times what you're going to have to do is put like Omniscience, one of your mana positive spells into your play, and then cast either Master's Acquisition or Fae of Wishes to get your final thing, and then you stack it so you'll be able to cast Approach of the Second Sun and kind of win from there. And Galvanic Adoration allows you to copy whatever important spell that you want to do. Sometimes you'll do things like Hidden Strings and stuff just to get yourself enough mana. A lot of times you have to be aware when using Omniscience if your opponent can interact with it, but otherwise oftentimes it just results in a free win once this enters play and you cast your spells. Sideboard, which you have access to in most of the games. You have things like Anger of the Gods and Ugin to deal with any type of board states your opponents might have. Obviously, Anger more important against the aggressive decks. Ugin's more important against the mid-range and control decks. Well, especially the mid-range decks, but it is quite nice as in a pinch as kind of an alternative win con. Peer into the Abyss, sometimes you'll wish for this to draw half your deck, just continue going off, especially if you're not able to get Omniscience in play. Approach the Second Sun is your primary win con, as it's in your sideboard. That's why you have a couple different copies of your different tutors to be able to go get it, and also plays around the fact of your opponent casting a Necromentia or something, and if you already have a Lotus Field available to you. Thought Distortion and Mystical Dispute are kind of your anti-control cards. Gotta be careful sometimes when casting Thought Distortion, as Narset's Reversal has kind of waned and waxed throughout the format, and that's kind of a brutal breakdown. But otherwise, this can't be countered spell that empties your control opponent's hand, quite important. Elder Gargaroth, mainly here for the aggressive decks, although I don't necessarily find this as a necessary thing. Aggressive decks are by far your worst matchup. And then Mazemind Tome when you need a little bit of grindy action against some of the other mid-range and control decks of the format where you need to grind out, find all your pieces as they're going to be discarding you and such. There are other cards that different variants play, but that is one card you can play at kind of the grindier matchups where your opponent's trying to discard spell you to death. Now we're going to take a look at a different variant of the deck. This is a version that I have not been able to find any finishes with, although it is piloted by a noted Storm player, especially in the Legacy format, Brian Cook. And that is the Wish Peer Through Depths, or Peer into the Abyss version, as opposed to the Emerging Ultimatum deck. The main thing, you're playing a lot of the same things. You're still playing a lot of the same mana packages, but you get to play things like Brawl, which makes your spells cheaper, allows you to loot if you're countering spells, which this version really doesn't do. But you have copies of Wish, which allow you to play out of your sideboard. Wish is a little bit weird because it says you may play a card you own from outside the game this turn. It does not actually put the card in your hand. What it does is give you access to your entire sideboard for the rest of that turn. And you can do this by playing lands, you can do it by playing anything in your sideboard. So it does have a little bit more flexibility than things like Mastermind's Acquisition or Granted. But, with the offset of having to play at that turn. And then obviously, one copy of Leer, very important for the Past and Flame Dusk effect. And then 3 copies of Peer in the Abyss to draw through your deck. Continue chaining off your hidden strings and your viziers, because mana is a little bit more important in this version than it is in the Omniscience version. Because obviously in the Omniscience version, once you have Omniscience in play, you don't really care about mana other than flashing stuff out of your graveyard. One thing I do need to mention about the land bases, in addition to the Lotus Fields and the Thespian stages, is the presence of Otawara and Boseiju, giving you quite nice answers and outs to your opponent's problematic stuff, whether it be some type of taxing effect, some type of Archon effect, whether it be Deafening Silence, Damping Sphere, etc. Various different things that can cause you problems. So it's definitely a huge upgrade to the deck to get access to all of these. And then this version has to play the Catcher of Triumphs over some of the other lands, because you do need access to red outside of just your Lotus Fields, and you also have 2 copies of Mana Confluence. This version notably is only running 3 copies of Lotus Field, but that's because with the 4 copies of Wish, you're basically getting another set of cards that can wish for, in addition to Sylvan Scrying, that can search for your Lotus Field. As far as the sideboard, this one's a little bit more red-centric, obviously, but you get to play Alpine Moon as kind of an out to the mirror match and against the Nykthos decks. Obviously, we've already mentioned Lotus Field. One thing you'll note in this version is there are no counter spells, but you do get to play 3 copies of Fry as kind of your anti-Narset technology, which we'll talk about that in the ways things opponents will bring in against you. Then Anger of the Gods and Swirling Mists are his go-to, March of Swirling Mists, his go-to answers for problematic creatures. Very important against the taxing effect creatures or against the creatures that keep you from playing more than one spell. Leyline Sanctity, very important against the discard spell decks, especially if they're bringing in, Go Blank in addition to everything else. Leer, we've already kind of touched on how important that is. And then Niv Mizzet is important in this version for a different reason, because this is actually the win con out of this deck, as opposed to Approach the Second Sun. You either pair Niv Mizzet with Peer into the Abyss, or you pair it with Valakut Awakening that we'll talk about. Valakut Awakening is a card that allows you to put any number on the cards on the bottom of your library. You can draw that many cards +1. Oftentimes with this version, you set up a Peer Through the Abyss, draw your deck, get your Niv Mizzet out of the sideboard, and then cast either an additional Peer into the Abyss or a copy of Valakut Awakening, and then just kind of gun your opponent down. Or alternatively, you can kind of go hard mode and just cast a bunch of spells with Niv Mizzet, pinging your opponent, draw a bunch of cards, and winning in that way. This version, I figured, was important to point out that there are a couple different variants of this deck running around, other than just alternatives of the Emergent Ultimatum build. Speaking of different versions of the Emergent Ultimatum build, this one has a few different cards, different than the previous one that we see. Still has the one of Fey of Wishes, still has the one Mastermind, but we have 2 copies of Dark Petition, or one of the copies of Pour Over the Pages. We still have a copy of Behold Beyond, which importantly does not say draw cards, which is very important. And then it plays a full 4 copies of Emergent Ultimatum. Once again, Omniscience is still the key to this deck, though you can win through your mana engine otherwise. Sideboard in this one has a few interesting things. You have a copy of Natural State to pair with another Boseiju against any type of problematic permanence. So your opponent might bring in the hate cards, whether it be Dampening Sphere or Deafening Silence. Blaststone is another out that you can kind of search for with your Sylvan Scrying against a lot of the hate permanents. And in this version, we're still playing Leyline Sanctity against discard decks. has a little bit of a different spread of removal. Plays Path of Peril against the creature decks in addition to Anger of the Gods, as Anger can't always answer, especially the Angels deck that has been popping up more and more, but that is something to note. Path of Peril, especially with the Cleave ability, can finish everything off. And then a One of Ugin to kind of tie everything together. Once again, the win con of this version is Approach of the Second Sun. And the final version we want to look at, the main deck isn't really terribly that different. This one, as far as its removal fleet's playing a little bit different. It's playing 3 Path of Peril for creatures. It's playing 2 Sphinx of the Final Word, which is an interesting one against the control decks. This is a 7 cost flying hexproof can't be countered spell. It says your instants and sorceries can't be countered. This kind of gives you a way to get around your opponent's counter spells in the various control decks. This one's a little bit more vulnerable to something like Narset, as we don't have any hard answers to Narset outside of bouncing with Alara. Once again, this deck has done a very good job of diversifying its spells to not be draw spells. They are just, go and search this, go search that kind of thing. So as far as cards to beat this deck, there is no single card that can shut down this deck that this deck doesn't have answers to. The number 1 card you would consider bringing in is either copies of something like Deafening Silence or Archon, or a copy of Damping Sphere, which obviously shuts down the Lotus Field, Thespian Stage Engine, or Alpine Moon. Those kind of effects that turn the Lotus Field into a glorified just one mana land, and then kind of shuts down the whole deck's engine. Other cards you can consider bringing in, discard spells, Go Blank, which hits, forces them to discard some of their resources while also getting rid of the graveyard. While it doesn't play a ton out of the graveyard, Leer is a tool that they have recently picked up a ton of copies of that is very important to kind of shut off. And then you have things like Narset, which keeps the deck from drawing cards, which, while it's important, the deck has evolved to a point where it can often at times get around just a Narset. Now, if you're backing up a Narset with counter spells, that can be a little bit more problematic, especially in game number 1. But, as we've seen, they do have counters to everything that will come in against them. The biggest way to get around them is just pure aggression, whether it be a deck like Mono Red that we just covered in our in-deck depth guide, or a deck like Spirits, either the banned or the blue variant, which is pressure backed up by counter spells. Your best bet is Disruption with pressure. It's one of the reasons why one of the deck's worst matchups before the banning was Winota, because Winota brought both Disruption and pressure. So not only did you have the crazy Winota turns, but you also had Archons in the sideboard. You had Elite Spellbinders, and you had all these different things that would just throw the deck off enough while you were kind of tempoing into the thing. One deck that has started to pop up a little bit, at least I've seen on Twitter a little bit here and there, is this kind of green-white company deck, which is basically Winota without Winota. You're playing Lovestruck Beasts and these different things, but you're also bringing in some of the white taxing effects. Makes for an interesting package that could potentially give Lotus Field combo here some problems. So, as I've kind of mentioned, the cards you want to play, you generally want pressure plus disruption enough. You give them enough time, they can work their way through a lot of things. But if you're able to go, Deafening Silence on 1, Damping Sphere on 2, and then just discard spell on different scenarios, you really can disrupt what they're doing. But given enough time, this deck will assemble its mana engine, and it will inevitably find a payoff card and kill you. So you do have to kill them in a quick, meaningful fashion. And like I said, playing the deck, you have access to a ton of your sideboard. You have access to a lot of your main deck between all the different tutor effects. So, a lot of it is learning the deck, piloting a lot, goldfishing, so to speak, learning to play lines, and just figuring out different ways. It's kind of more, this deck is more akin to of a puzzle than it is a Magic deck sometimes. But to me, it's one of the more interesting decks I've ever seen of a Storm deck or something. Although it doesn't obviously use the Storm mechanic, but it's very much an interesting puzzle deck that you're using, math for the counting with the lands. What are the chances of drawing this card? What are your outs in this situation? Say, if your opponent has 1 counter spell and you're dead next turn, what's the best way to try to sequence to get your opponent's card out, etc. So this deck has been a lot of fun. I played a little bit of the practice rooms. While I don't have the subscription I used to have to Man Traders, I did pick up the All Access Pass to play test a few decks and such to kind of get a better feel for this and some other stuff this week, for the next couple of weeks at least. But I thought it was a very fun deck to play some games with, and it was interesting to try to puzzle things out. So if you like to solve puzzles in your Magic the Gathering, this is definitely the deck for you. It's placed in the meta. It kind of rises and falls with how much aggressive decks are in the format. Whether it be mono red, the spirits decks, whether mono black aggro makes a comeback at some point. Whatever deck rises to replace Winota in the aggressive slot. Those are the kind of decks that tend to give you problems. This deck can play through a lot of different things. I haven't seen any surgical like necromentia or any of those kind of effects lately. So, obviously you might see one or two something like Niv or something that has access to bring the light. But, this deck does a pretty good job of diversifying its spells. So generally, unless they can get your Lotus Field, you're not out of it. And even with the Wisp version, you can go get the one out of your sideboard. So, if you can shut down the mana engine, like Thoughtseize, their Sylvan Scrying, if they're relying on that, you buy yourself a lot of time. But if you can't disrupt the mana engine, then you really need to get them dead as soon as possible, because they will go off a turn or two later. So, that said, this has been our in-depth deck guide for Lotus Field combo in Pioneer. And there are a couple streamers that cover this. I've already covered Brian Cook. There's one other one that I'll try to remember to link in the description for this video. But, if you want to see some resources about how to play the deck, as this is kind of one of the decks that is a little bit less well covered out there in the community. So, but this has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what deck you want to see in the next video.